Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon. I'm Fathurahman, and today I'd like to present my research proposal about the effect of profitability, leverage, public and institutional ownership on environmental disclosure. This research proposal consists of 3 chapters. Chapter 1 is about the introductions of this research. Chapter 2 about the theoretical review, and Chapter 3 about the research methods. So about the background of this research, first, human activities, especially error in industrial control, can result in major environmental damage. Second, the responsibility and concern for the environment by public companies in Indonesia are still very minimal. Next, Jakarta is the city with the highest environmental risk out of 414 cities around the world. This was a research made by Mapleprof in 2021. And last, there's a case in Indonesia, especially in Blitar, about PT Greenfields. So their waste flows from their water shelter into the river. This research was made from the contradiction from some of previous researches, and you could see in this graphic. And next, about the question of this research. Number one, does profitability have influence on environmental disclosure? And 2, does leverage have influence on environmental disclosure? 3, does public ownership have influence on environmental disclosure? And number 4, does institutional ownership have influence on environmental disclosure? The objectives of this research is to test the effect of profitability on environmental disclosure in non-cyclical consumer companies. Number 2, to test the effect of leverage on environmental disclosure in non-cyclical consumer companies. And next, to test the effect of public ownership on environmental disclosure in non-cyclical consumer companies. And number 4, testing the effect of institutional ownership on environmental disclosure in non-cyclical consumer companies. And there are also benefits of this research. This research will explore more deeply whether there is an influence exerted by variables. The variables are profitability, leverage, public ownership, and institutional ownership on environmental disclosure in non-cyclical consumer companies. And this research could become an additional reference for other researchers who are interested in continuing and updating this study with future studies armed with more relevant data and variables. This research could be used as a reference by non-cyclical consumer companies as a matter of consideration and evaluation in deciding various company policies related to the environment. Next, this research could be used as consideration to investors so that the investment could be channeled and directed to the right company. And this research could also be taken into consideration in making policies and regulations regarding corporate environmental disclosure in Indonesia. In this research, there are 2 grand theories that I've used. First one is legitimacy theory, and second one is stakeholder theory. But there are also another theory about environmental disclosure, profitability, leverage, public ownership, and institutional ownership. Okay, so about legitimation theory, persons in Dowling and Favor 1975 viewed legitimacy as the assessment of action in terms of shared values in the context of actions involvement in social systems. The large companies should try to gain this legitimacy from the public because the bigger the company, the more people will be involved in the company's operational actions. So, about the stakeholder theory, this theory will deals with relationships between the companies and with many stakeholders. A company usually has a large number of stakeholders, especially a public company. Okay, so the stakeholders interested in the affairs of the entity. Edward Freeman in 2010 stated that value creation becomes a collaborative effort in a mutually beneficial relationship between businesses and all of their stakeholders. This is because the business is built with a specific purpose that becomes the basis for stakeholders to cooperate and establish relationships with the business. So, according to Ghazali and Chariri in Moide and Nanto, about the environmental disclosure, is a process that used by companies in order to disclose their information. Okay, so the information could be consist of the company's activities and impact and their impact on social communities and environmental conditions. Next, about profitability and leverage. So profitability, and you could be referred it to as net income, is the excess of income and gains on expenses for a fiscal period. And about leverage, Wardani et al. In 2019 said leverage is a measuring tool used to measure a company's capacity or ability to pay all debts that they own. Okay, public ownership. The Sugiarto in Agustina et al. Explained that companies that are listed in the capital market, especially in Indonesia capital market or IDX, must have a portion of investors. And in institutional ownership, Brigham and Houston 2019 stated that majority of shares nowadays are starting to be owned by institutional investor or entity. So is there any effect of profitability on environmental disclosure? Companies with high profitability would mean they have a high source of funds to respond to the pressures and demands of the community to be more concerned about the environmental issue. Okay, so they responding this environmental issue, by making environmental disclosure. Chu et al. Stated that these financially well-performing companies want to let the public know that they are also committed to providing reciprocity to the community and informing the public about their environmental initiatives through environmental disclosure reporting. The hypothesis from this theory is profitability would positively affect environmental disclosure. Next, is leverage will affect on environmental disclosure. Companies with higher level of leverage typically have better compliance with environmental laws and regulations, said Diantimala and Amril in 2018. In Chu et al. 2020 reports, they state that companies with higher leverage tend to be more committed to demonstrating their environmental practice and contribution to their stakeholder. It will also demonstrate that companies are committed to complying with all relevant environmental regulation and laws. The hypothesis from this theory is leverage positively affects environmental disclosure. How public ownership affects on environmental disclosure? Hamdani et al. In 2017 argues that public ownership is also an indication that the company is able to operate continuously, or we could say going concern. So it will make a widespread disclosure. A portion of the company's share ownership by public investor will have influence on the company in environmental disclosure. The public will assume that companies that care about the environment will maintain the sustainability of their business. And of course, because of that, companies will get good legitimacy from the public. The hypothesis is public ownership positively affects environmental disclosure. Okay. And last, is institutional ownership affects environmental disclosure? So, Diantimala and Amril in 2018 say companies with larger institutional holdings should disclose more environmental information and have incentives or strong incentives to communicate with companies' institutional holdings about environmental achievement. And also, they could reduce institutional ownership misconception and then strengthen institutional ownership and strengthen the trust of institutional ownership investment. The hypothesis from this theory is institutional ownership positively affects environmental disclosure. Okay, so it's the summary of the hypothesis. Next, to the chapter 3 about the research methods. The analytical unit of this research is non-cyclical consumer company listed on the Indonesian Stock Exchange or IDX. The population is non-cyclical consumer companies that listed in Bursa Efek Indonesia or Indonesia Stock Exchange IDX in the period 2018 to 2020. And about the samples, these are the criteria of the samples. There are 63 sample company samples, and observation is, and the total of observation from 2018 to 2020 are about 189. Okay, so variable operationalization. So the formula for this variable are like this. First, environmental disclosure or ED is total disclosure that you found in the report. And so divided by GRI index, total in GRI index. And profitability, I use ROA. ROA is net income per total assets, and leverage using DAR, debt to asset ratio, is about debt totals per total assets. Next, about public ownership or KP. It's about total shares owned by public or total company shares multiple by 100%. And about institutional ownership or KI is total shares owned by institutional or total company shares multiple by 100%. And next, about the analytical techniques. Okay, so first step of analytical techniques is descriptive statistical analysis, and then choosing the regression model, and 2 classic assumption tests, and next multiple linear analysis, and then hypothesis test. Okay, that's all for me. So thank you for your attention. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.